We'll go ahead and call federal and state affairs to order, March 1st, Tuesday. You guys want to shut the doors? Michael, you want to click the door shut? Everybody can get set down. First thing on the agenda is bill introductions. President Masterson, you got some bills for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, I have two RS numbers. I gave them to Michael, but to repeat, it's
Let's
RS.
do one at a time that
All
way.
right. I'm not sure which one is which. I think first one. So one is RS 3214. These are both judicial selection.
Okay, do we have any
amendments.
objections to this bill? Not seeing any. It's
I think that one was federal model, and the second one is RS 2652, which is elections for Supreme Court. So, and the reason I'd like to have these introduced, it's a topic that we already have valued them both on the amendment and this year, and I'd like to see not just life, but liberty and pursuit of happiness on the ballot. And so I'd like to actually have you have the discussions around our body have discussions around whether it's federal model or elections. We need a new system. So.
Okay, any objections? Not seeing any. It's introduced. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mr. Chairman.
It's good to see you down here.
Just want to introduce it.
Let me see if there's any other, do we have any other bill introductions? Okay, Senator Fasquedo, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today in the Senate chamber, we will do a resolution, blindness awareness. And so members of Envision are here. If the three of you will stand up, and just say your names real quick. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. They are from Wichita.
Oh, thank you
Thank you.
for coming. Thanks. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and start on our hearing. Senate Bill 479. Jason, you want to give us an overview? We'll go ahead and open the hearing up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 479 would require the Capital Preservation Committee to approve plans for a permanent memorial in the state capitol commemorating the Kansas suffragist movement that achieved the right of women to vote in Kansas and the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This bill is similar to the bill you heard and passed out earlier this session on the Gold Star families in terms of just the structure of the bill with the approval of the memorial, the provisions for the Secretary of Administration to receive monies in the form of grants or gifts or contributions to finance the creation and construction of the memorial for the Kansas suffragist movement. There's also the provision that no public funds be used for the financing, the creation and construction of the memorial. And the bill does establish a fund in the state treasury, the Kansas Suffragist Memorial Fund, for receipt of those gifts and donations to fund the memorial. It would go into effect on July 1st of this year if enacted, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Jason? Not seeing any, we'll go ahead and open the hearings to the proponents. Senator Bowers? It looks like you've got every member of the committee signed on to your bill.
Almost, I did. Thank you for noticing, Mr. Chairman. So thank you for letting me testify on Senate Bill 479. It does have a companion bill in the House. It's House Bill 2661. So far as I can tell, it hasn't had a hearing yet like we're doing today. And the bill originated from Capital Preservation Committee. It's 12 members. And I do have the chairman of the committee with me, and she's here if you have any questions. Executive Director of the Kansas Historical Society, Jenny Chin, is here. We've worked close together on the Brown versus Board Memorial, and this is a fascinating committee where it is teamwork, and I appreciate Jenny's leadership on that. So this bill, as you can read in the testimony, what our charge is by the Kansas Legislature. And in October of this year, we met, and we do have a representative of the Kansas League of Women Voters, Seal King, is with us, and I believe she will be the next one to speak, Mr. Chairman, that we have someone is ill, so she's filling in. So you'll hear from her in a moment. Very similar to the Eisenhower statute that we did several years ago, and this year's 330 Gold Star families, which come out of the committee. And once the bill is approved, then the sponsors will work with the Capital Preservation Committee to make sure the plan fits into the grounds and follow through. Then on the back is a little history on voting for women in Kansas. July 5th, 1859 was the Kansas Constitutional Convention, Equal Rights and Civil Rights for Kansas Women. Then 1887, Kansas women gained the right to vote in municipal elections. And then 1912, 8 years before the ratification of the National Women's Suffrage Amendment, Kansas was the 8th state to extend full equal voting rights to women. I'm going to go off script just a second, and I'm from a little town called Delphus, and in the center square of this nice little town of 500 people is a monument, and a little girl named Grace Bedell, she was 10 years old, wrote to Abraham Lincoln convincing him to grow a beard. Her theory was that he would be more attractive to women, and they convinced their menfolk to vote for him. And the best part of that is he wrote her back. And so that letter and her letter to him is on the monument downtown, if you ever want to go see that. And just shows that women were thinking ahead, even back when Abraham Lincoln was running for president, even though they couldn't vote. I believe that's where I'll stop. And if you have any questions for me, I serve on the committee appointed by the Senate President. And I'm happy to tell you anything I know about the committee, which is a wonderful committee to serve on.
Okay, we'll go ahead and allow some questions. Are there any questions? Senator Fasco.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning,
morning.
Senator Elaine Bowers. And I remember in your little town, you told me about the race that the little turtles have.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm,
Toodle Fest.
okay.
Toodle race.
So where exactly would this memorial or monument be placed?
And the committee will decide that when they come back to us after they have their funding raised and their design, which we'll approve and work with them. No specific spot yet, but that'll be part of the committee process moving forward after the funds are raised and the plans are approved.
Okay, further questions or comments? Thank you, Senator Bowers. It's always a pleasure. Marlene Merrills, or I guess we got a stand-in.
Right, thank you.
Give us your name.
I'm C.L. King with the League of Women Voters of Kansas. And yeah, Marlene Merrill is not available to speak today to you, so she asked me to come and help out.
Not a problem.
Okay, so we appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today about this project. It was the League of Women Voters, and this idea began with our centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment. And so the League spent 4 years working on the memorial or the celebration of the amendment. And one of the projects was a traveling exhibit, which did pass through the State House last year, actually 2 years ago now. During the session, it was 9 panels, 20 or 30 inches wide each and 7 feet tall. And it stood in the gallery or in the lobby for a week, I believe it was. And the committee that worked on this was, excuse me, it was composed of not only League members, but the American Association of University Women. And I believe you might have written testimony from one of those gals who was on the committee, and it still is on this committee for the Suffragist Memorial. We also worked with artists and fundraisers and numerous other people on that traveling exhibit. When we finished the components of our centennial celebration, we found that we still had $34,000 left. And one of our larger donors for that money suggested that we might ask for a memorial in the State House for the women's suffragists. And we thought that was an excellent idea. So we gave the testimony in October to the Capital Preservation Committee, and they unanimously approved this idea. And you were asking about funds and where it might go, what it might look like. And yes, that is all to be worked out. We understood that we might consider placements after the Capital Committee suggested, whether it might be a mural whether it might be a statute, whether it might be a relief. We would need to know what the possibilities are for where this might go in order to ask for requests for ideas from artists, and then to know how much more money we needed to raise. So we appreciate the fund in the Treasurer's Office. We appreciate the support from the Capital Preservation Committee, and we appreciate your support by passing this bill so that we can get started on it. And I stand for questions.
Okay, questions? Do we have any questions? Not seeing any, thank you. We have one more written proponent. We'll close the hearing on 479. We have no neutrals, no opponents, so, committee, this is one of these bills, I'm assuming with everybody signed on it, we could probably go ahead and just work the bill. Senator Hildebrand?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and being one of the co-sponsors, I would make a motion that we pass this out and favorably for passage to the consent calendar.
Okay, Senator Fasco seconds. Any questions or comments? Not seeing any. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against nay, it passes. It's on the consent calendar and it'll be posted soon. So the bill is heard and passed. So thank you guys for coming. We'll move on to our next bill, Senate Bill 389. Jason, you want to give us an overview? That's good. I don't know if we can get this one past that quick.
Why not?
We'll try.
Calendar bill to me.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Senate Bill 389 is a bill, another election bill. This would create new election law requiring the use of an individual, durable, voter-verified paper ballot with a distinctive watermark for all elections. The ballot would be required to be marked by hand or by use of a marking or printing device or system, would be made subject to inspection and verification by the voter before it is cast and counted, and would be canvassed by hand or by a vote tabulating equipment. The bill also provides provisions where the paper ballot would be preserved and would constitute the official ballot for all audit and recount purposes. So any recounts that would be required under election law would be a hand count, unless the requester requesting that the recount elects not to have a hand count recount of the election. Any inconsistencies between and during a recount would be resolved with the paper ballot being deemed the true and correct record of the vote cast. If the ballots are tabulated by a vote tabulating machine, then there must be a hand count audit of a sample of those ballots that's conducted in accordance with rules and regulations adopted by the Secretary of State. And finally, the bill would prohibit the use of any poll books that do not require a handwritten signature. This would go into effect on July 1st if enacted, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Senator Fasco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, say that again, what you just said about the handwritten signature.
Sure. So the poll book where the voter shows up at the polling place to vote must require a handwritten signature of the voter, presumably for matching purposes to ensure the voter identity. Any poll book that doesn't require a handwritten signature would be prohibited under the bill.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so then we would do away with that. Now you could kind of the electronic monitor where you just kind of use your finger or pen. So would we still have that?
I believe as long as the monitor allows for a handwritten signature on the tablet, that presumably would be okay, but I defer to the Secretary of State and their rules and regs on that.
Thank you.
Senator Hildebrand?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, if I am unable to write a signature, an X or a mark or anything else would constitute my signature. Is that correct?
Again, I would defer to the Secretary of State on that question.
Thank you.
We'll have a point to ask them that question. Any further questions? Not seeing. Thank you, Jason. We'll go ahead and open the hearing on Senate Bill 389. First one up, Richard Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Senate Bill 489 is a bill that I had introduced and,
489.
or 389, I apologize. I was getting my numbers crossed, a little dyslexic there, I guess. 389 would require all paper ballots to have a watermark, and then after the election cycle, a hand audit of those paper ballots. And I know right now in the state of Kansas, there's a statute that requires a stamp by the election clerk, but they actually have to put that stamp on there, physically put it on there on each one. My experience is human error could cause an election clerk to miss one, possibly, but this watermark would be something that would be distinct and would be determined each election cycle by the Secretary of State. The watermark would be on the paper ballot, so there would be no error on whether or not someone forgot to stamp a ballot or not. And I stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, we'll hold questions. We'll do the proponents and then go to questions. Missy Levitt, she's virtual. Are you there?
Good morning, Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I stand as a proponent for SB 389 as the security and integrity of every ballot is of the utmost importance. So much so that the CISA Act of 2018 oversees the election processes with the guidance of the election infrastructure subsector as a matter of critical infrastructure and national security. I believe that whatever improvements can be made to ballot authenticity should be highly considered by the legislature. I see additional value with this bill as well. If it were to be slightly amended, I would like to ask that the committee actively consider adding a tear-off serial number to the ballots that a voter can detach and take home. If this feature was added in addition to watermarks, it would expand the ability of counties and voters to authenticate and verify proper tracking of a ballot after it is cast. As I view it, new and functional reporting from this would be a welcomed feature for those of us who are actively seeking to improve our elections. Watermarks and tear-off serial numbers could also be specific to the type of ballot for later ease of review in certain cases. Currently, the Secretary of State can remove detailed reports as he sees fit, and this is highly concerning, as in a 2020 court case, the Shawnee District Court proves that the Kansas Secretary of State's office is willing to remove access to court-ordered open public records and available election reports. Reports like this are very valuable for the integrity of transparency of our elections, and the ability to track and verify the information pertaining to ballots should be improved so that the localities can manage their own reports without interference from the Secretary of State and his disregard for court decisions on statutory open public records. Simply put, the authority of the Kansas Secretary of State can be abused to disenfranchise public access to whatever they want to limit, despite legislative and court directives set forth. This week in my county, our Board of County Commissioners established a community-ran audit and advisory committee to assist with our local election process. As a member of that committee and with the procedures to initiate and hand count our elections in this next cycle, it would be of great importance to us that we be able to better trust and authenticate a ballot via watermarks. And if it were amended to include tear-off serial numbers, each ballot could be tracked and validated without privacy violations to the voter. I see it overwhelmingly beneficial to maintain all records of these types of reports can be utilized and meant to be held as public information. Ultimately, my view is that any watermark or tear-off serial number for ballot records can be significant in tools for generating reports that are not necessarily located in a place where they might be removed to proceed with the next election cycle. And as an advocate for election integrity and security, this is an amazing opportunity that makes simple changes to the process without harming the overall function of the ballot, but improves the entire scope of how it can be tracked and protected during the election process and after. And this kind of reporting is open public record and, quite frankly, very valuable to committees like we have established in my own county as we move forward to provide the trust and election process. And considerations like this are of a high priority for us. Thank you for your time. I'll stand for questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Do we have questions? Senator Fasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Senator Hildebrand. Okay, there was an echo. Okay, it's fixed now. You've got a few pieces in the legislation, Senate Bill 389. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the watermark piece of it? So would it just require a marker, like if you go to the grocery store and you give them a $20 or $50 bill and they'll like take the marker and go through it to make sure that it's real? I mean, elaborate on that piece a little more.
Sir, and Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Senator Foscato. So the watermark would be like what you have on a $20 bill or any dollar bill. You hold it up to like there's a watermark. It would be embedded into the paper. And one thing, and this, I'll address my comment that I had, since this ties in with her question a little bit. I neglected to say that I think that if we do work this bill, that we do need to put an amendment on time frame, because right now there's not a time for enacting other than the statute book, and that would not give the Secretary of State or county election officers enough time to implement this. So I would probably be bringing an amendment to give the clerk and the clerks and the Secretary of State more time to implement it.
Senator Fasco.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Hildebrand. And then on the requiring the signature, are we taking in consideration of those with disabilities or you know, and I'm going to say even for myself, Mr. Chairman, so years ago I broke my wrist, and so my signature changes quite often. So did we take in consideration of those with disabilities, and their signatures are kind of shaky at times? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Senator, and representative from Secretary of State will correct me if I am wrong, but my understanding of a signature is it's your signature at the time you sign it. So my signature 10 years ago is not the same as my signature today, so they just verify that that was your signature today, and also that your signature doesn't have to be your full name, it can be a mark.
Other questions? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question is, I think, also for Senator Hildebrand. Does the Secretary of State's office currently have like size and paper weight requirements on paper ballots?
That I would have to defer
Shaking
to
his
the,
head no.
yes, Secretary of State's
Oh.
office.
You want to say something just to clear up a couple things?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker from the Secretary of State's office. Senator Straub, each county purchases their own paper depending on their type of equipment, so we have no standards for paper weight or dimensions.
Other questions or comments? Do you have follow-up? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had assumed that because I'm well aware that each county can purchase their own voting equipment within reason. So how exactly would this watermark work? Would it be the same watermark for the entire state, or does each county get to pick a unique watermark specific to that county?
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator. The Secretary of State, each election cycle, we determine what that unique watermark would be for the entire state.
Does that answer your questions? Okay. Senator Fasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Hildebrand. So this watermark, would it be on the advance ballots mailed out as well, or just on the ballot in the voting location? So all of them or some of them are? Thank you.
So the watermark would be on all paper ballots. The only exception that it could be would be on a federal. So military, they operate under federal guidelines and rules. So there might be, because I believe right now they can do it by email and other regulations. So that would be the only area that a watermark might not be on a ballot.
Okay, further questions or comments? Not seeing any. Okay, we'll move on to the opponents. Virtual Larry Burke. Is he not on? We'll move his to written then. Next up, Mike Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And I'm, as the chair said, I'm Mike Burgess and the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. And just to jump right to it, because some of the questions that came up earlier that one of the members asked dealt with the ability to make a mark and do other things. We would still probably prefer to see some language similar to the way it works in other areas, because there are individuals with quadriplegia, for instance, where their signature could be a wink. And then you need a process for an affidavit for someone else to be able to sign with permission that person gave their signature. And so that's the crux of our, that if we can address that in a meaningful way, and we'd be happy to work with the proponents on that. But that would remove our concerns with the bill is just, that handwritten signature piece. We would prefer to see that additional security to make sure that someone, with the instance with the quadriplegia, where there would be an affidavit process as well. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Questions? Thank you. Virtual David Hamlet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Olson, members of the committee. So first off, I have a couple concerns I want to highlight, which makes me an opponent to this. First off, I don't know if it was a drafting error, but there's actually a section 1A3, but there is no section 1A2. So, I mean, I think that could be fixed with a simple amendment, but that's how I was reading it, to be missing a section and not be ordered correctly. Mr. Burgess just covered the disability concern that we had about this disenfranchising people, because again, just being very careful about anything that's very black and white with shalls that can accidentally exclude people that need specific accommodations. For the ballot watermark, I have some concerns because the state doesn't actually print that paper, right? This is proprietary software. It comes from different, the proprietary software and machine vendors is where they get the paper from. And so it's not just like the state can say, oh, I want this watermark printed. The state has to negotiate with private companies to get that watermark. And then there's also an existing stockpile concern. For example, a county might have stockpiled to save money in smaller counties, a lot of extra ballot paper. Again, because the ballot paper is not live until it has, the unique mark on it. But this would make any stockpiles irrelevant. It would also mean that every single election, they would have to buy more and more paper, and all of that is extra would be thrown out. All of this cost would be borne by local governments with no support from the state. On ballot corrections in section 1A, 1B, it requires that voters have the opportunity to correct an error, to correct errors on their voter verified paper ballot. I'm not sure how this would occur though, because usually the process we're talking about is you have cast, entered your information on a machine that's printed your piece of paper, and then you can look at the ballot piece of paper before you drop it in, but there wouldn't necessarily be a way to correct that. What you would really do is you would go over, you would identify the error, have a poll worker assist you in voiding that ballot and spoiling it and casting a new one. And so again, that language, it's just how I read it. It's a little unclear how that would practically be implemented. I have a concern about count inconsistencies. This in section 1A 5, it talks about requiring the hand count to be the true and correct record. and that when there's any irregularities in the count, that the hand count would be the prevailing record. But it doesn't talk about if this impacts the audit that's talked about later, because it says that at every polling place you have to be having this sample audit. That is a hand recount, but it's only a sample. Again, it's a little unclear to me how that would be implemented on that level, because it talks about different types of hand counts throughout this bill. And then the final concern is around what appears to be in section 1B. It appears to be implying that the state would adopt a risk limiting audit. Again, something, as I've spoken to this committee before, I strongly support. Although if that is the intention of this, that should be explicitly stated, and give the space for counties to work towards that, because that takes sometimes, that takes preparation time. It takes specific types of equipment to be able to do that risk limited audit. And again, it's kind of vague in this, if that's what it's asking for, or if it's not a risk limiting audit, how would the randomization process occur? And I think Senator Hildebrand had pointed this out, but I don't see timeframes or deadlines for establishing these types of audits or whenever they would have to be conducted. So again, I think that the direction of this could be promising, but there's a lot of concerns about the technicalities of this and potentially the unfunded aspect that could be borne by counties. So with that, I'm happy to stand for questions, but as it is, I would hope the committee would oppose the bill in its current state. Thank you.
Okay, do we have questions? Senator Hildebrand?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a question, just a clarification. Mr. Hammett said at the voting place, but the bill actually says or counting place by the election board. So there's two parts to that. The audit does not have to take place at the polling place. It can take place at the election office by the election board. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Senator Fascadeau?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Hildebrand. You're getting close. You're warming up to Davis. I have a question for Dave Hammett.
Yes, Senator.
I'm sorry, I wanted to call you Davis. So you mentioned there's a
Davis.
piece.
Davis, my name. Sorry. I know it's a little weird. My first name is what's usually a last name, but my first name is Davis.
Davis, okay, and it's on here as Dave. So you mentioned something that you do, a measure that you do support in the bill. So can you elaborate on that piece again? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator. It discusses a random selection audit throughout the bill. Particularly, I think this is section 1B, and a random selection audit is what I think what it is implying is something that is commonly referred to as a risk limiting audit. But right now, Kansas, we have traditional audits where you essentially you pick a couple precincts and you're recounting all the ballots there for one race. What a random selection, like a risk limiting audit, will do is it's kind of sophisticated. It's a statistical method, but you'll randomly pull a variety of different ballots. And on all the races, what it does is it gives you a statistical measure of confidence on the outcome of the races. Again, it's a little complicated to explain, but basically every ballot has a number that's corresponding. They would be randomly generated, and you could take samples of those to get a degree of confidence in the overall outcome of the election. And for elections where smaller errors could have a bigger impact on the outcome of election, more ballots are audited. So for example, if someone won by a landslide, you're not as concerned about it, right? If they won by 30 percentage points, it's not as big of a deal. You'll do a smaller audit. But if someone won by, say, 0.25%, a handful of votes can make a big difference. The audit would then make them pull a lot more ballots to be reviewed to have more confidence. So it's about, it really tries to give you a degree of statistical confidence and really focus in where the most likely impactful problem would be.
Okay. Did Senator Hosher, did you, no, Senator Straub?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I haven't delved into the bill that deeply, but on the point that Davis had made about reprinting or correcting a ballot, that somewhat concerns me because how many ballots are we going to print for each voter? I know from experience on a board of county canvassers that Kansas is a voter intent state. So let's say a mail-in ballot, somebody had filled in a bubble and then erased that bubble and then filled in a new bubble. Some of the counting equipment is so sensitive that it would kick that ballot out because it might recognize a small mark in one bubble or both bubbles, and it would kick that ballot out. Well, then the board of canvassers would review those ballots and try to determine if they can surmise that the voter intended to vote for whichever candidate, then that ballot would be counted for, whichever candidate they could tell they were intending to vote for. But I think printing multiple ballots per voter could be a problem.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Senator Fasquedo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're asking opponents now. Mike Burgess, are you still here? So you said your main concern of the legislation was the signature aspect of it. Is that all? And then you're supportive of the bill?
Well, that removes our concern. That would be, I guess, which would move us out of the opponent category. So I think otherwise, I mean, from a disability perspective, as long as there aren't any other changes that would negatively impact, it would address our concerns. And at that point, we have no opinion on the bill, if that makes sense. And to Senator Straub's question too, I mean, there are situations where an individual, they use an electronic, this would pertain to individuals with disabilities or with not, but if they're using a ballot marking device, which would be the accessible equipment, and they notice that something was incorrect after it was marked, I believe that was the situation that he was referring to. So there are, at least it's been a couple years since I've been a supervising judge, but typically a person can request another ballot in that situation if they notice an error before they submit it to be counted. So likewise, if they're using a paper ballot, it'd be the same.
Questions? Comments?
Right. Well, thank you.
Senator Hosher?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if maybe this is for Davis or whoever wants to jump in, but if I'm reading some of the other written-only testimony, am I understanding correctly that implementation of this bill could potentially, and you may have said this and I missed it, I'm sorry. Implementation of this bill might mean that certain counties would have to purchase new equipment, especially if they are already contracted with a particular vendor for their ballots?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator. Yes, so to have the watermark conversation is really, I was so sorry. Okay, so for the risk limiting aspect of it, or the random sample audit, depending on how that is conducted, because it leaves a lot up to rules and regs, though, the way I'm most familiar with that being conducted is there's actually equipment like that tracks and creates records of every ballot. So for example, on the optical scanners, it might be like, this ballot's number is 5,000,048, blah, 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 right? And so each thing gets a number through that tracking equipment, which allows them to create the random selection because every ballot has to have essentially some sort of number that you can therefore randomly select from. That is a specific type of equipment, right? And I forgot if it was in this committee where there was discussion of even if you can access images of the ballot, and then it's like some machines produce those images, some older machines do not. It would just depend on how it's done. But my understanding, how I'm familiar with it, you do need some more advanced equipment to be able to facilitate random audits. And many counties might, or some counties might not have that equipment. And then on the watermark aspect, this would be, I mean, I would imagine this is doable for everyone, but again, they would have to negotiate with their individual vendors. So I'm not sure if every company uses ES&S in Kansas. That's one of the primary providers. But if someone doesn't, I think there might even be Dominion provide, a couple of smaller counties with Dominion and others, but they would have to essentially negotiate with each of those companies to provide these watermarks. So it'd be, again, this is not just something that the state prints. The state would have to negotiate with the providers to print those watermarks. And because different counties use different equipment, there might be different providers. So the state might have to negotiate with several companies to get that same watermark printed. And then any extra paper, any extra ballot paper, which again, this stuff is not cheap. You know, I believe it costs over $0.25 a ballot. The WARCs would probably make that go up a couple cents whenever you're talking about millions of ballots. The price can get high pretty quickly. And again, the state's not, at least in this bill, the state's not offering aid to help counties with that. Counties would have to incur that, and any extra ballot paper would be completely useless because every election there would be a different watermark would be needed.
Okay. And I did have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
Thank you. A section of the bill requires a hand-counted audit. Does that then, I think Senator Straub brought this up on a different bill, cause issues in regard to keeping your ballot secret?
So that, if it's like an audit conducted, oh, sorry.
Yep, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So there is, if it's an audit conducted, you know, with appropriate standards where there's usually essentially bipartisan observers and it's conducted in a secure environment, hand-counted audits are, I mean, we currently do those. There's not a secrecy issue with that because they're done in very controlled type environments where it's impossible to know whose ballot they're seeing and counting. But again, this is stuff that right now there's not a concern about that. Depending on how it's implemented, there could become a concern depending on what sort of information is available to the person who's reviewing the ballot in front of them. Because right now it's just usually the ballot that is in front of them.
Probably be a great question for Secretary of State's office. So Senator Fasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So clarifying question for Jason, our Senator Hildebrand. So the ballots we're speaking of, so if I walk into because I like to vote in person, so we're talking about also like in my neck of the woods, we get a slip and then the poll worker inserts it into the machine. Then I vote and then it comes out at the end and I turn it in. Are we talking about that ballot being watermarked? Or are we talking about any ballot period to be watermarked?
So the intention, and Jason can correct me if that's not the way the bill reads, is any paper ballot would have a watermark. So when you go to the electronic voting machine and it kicks you out a verifiable paper ballot, that paper ballot would have that watermark on it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to clarify, I'm not opposed to hand counting. I think that could actually help identify if there are if there's been electronic fraud. So not opposed to hand counting. I think what Senator Holscher was referring to earlier was the public notary of a ballot. That I think kind of infringes on individual liberties and having a secret ballot. But I have a question. Does the state have the capability, or could the state have the capability to print all of this paper? Or is that paper that works with certain vendor voting equipment, is that paper proprietary to that vendor? Or is it something that once we receive the paper, we can send it to the state and have the state watermark it and send it back to the...
That's probably another good question for Secretary of State's office.
Okay.
We'll have him answer that question here in a minute. Any other questions for the opponents? Not seeing any, we'll move on to the neutrals. Clay Barker, and you've already got your first question, so you can answer that too.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, Clay Barker, the General Counsel from the Secretary of State's office, and thank you for the opportunity to testify on this bill. Our office is neutral because the contents of the bill don't affect us directly. They affect counties, and I'll do my best to answer your questions on county practice, but each county can vary somewhat depending on its equipment, and they may be the best source. So if I can't answer questions, we'll get you an answer. We had 5 points of substance, and first of all, I'd like to thank Senator Hildebrand for bringing up the timing aspect on this. I've learned from the School of Hard Knocks that sometimes getting regulations out takes longer than it seems like it should, often because we have to gather input from all the counties and then other states that may have tried something similar. In a perfect world, it might take 6 months, but sometimes it just takes longer. Then we have to make sure the counties can actually implement it. Okay, on to our 5 points. First, on the watermark, we've talked to each vendor of equipment in Kansas. They say all their equipment can take paper that has watermarks on it, whether it comes from a ballot marking device where heat pins actually mark the device, not ink, or it's printed, or it's a hand ballot. They can all have the same watermark. The counties each have to get their own paper that's specific to their own equipment. So they have separate contracts, but we could standardize a watermark for everyone. The only 2 ballots that we're aware of that this couldn't apply to are federal write-in absentee ballots, which are a very unique niche. And I don't know if this would apply, but each polling place in Kansas has to have at least one ballot marking device for the disabled that if there isn't a standard ballot can print it on plain paper. And I think those 2 exceptions are already in the code, and they'd be pretty narrow. The second part was on the voter verified paper ballot provisions. I'd just like to announce that all counties in Kansas now have this equipment. Harvey's may not have arrived yet, but they've signed the contract. The language, and this was brought up by the clerks, that you could not use, or you had to use non-tabulating ballot marking devices. There may be 5 or more counties in Kansas that still have older equipment. It produces a paper ballot, but it also tabulates, and they may be required to buy new equipment under this statute. I just don't know how many counties those are. On the hand recount portion, no issue with that, but we need to make some modifications to the recount statute so they reconcile with each other as to the priority of hand counting or choice counting and who pays for it. On the audit at the polling place or counting place, and Mr. Hammett did a good job of going over some of the issues, which I believe this is a type of risk limiting audit. But this is leaving a lot of discretion to our office to determine things like the parameters and the confidence intervals. And each ballot can have 10, 15 different individuals to vote for, especially if you have judicial retention elections. And we probably have to come up with some understanding of how many different offices we'd be actually doing the audit for. And as Mr. Hammett pointed out, it would probably require either purchasing or creating some specialized software to give you the random number based on how many votes there are, how close the race seemed, contents like that. And on the 5th point, on the poll book signatures, I believe our concerns were answered. As long as it's still on a screen, that should be fine. And Senator Hildebrand was correct. The statutes in Kansas, like for a registration form, say a hand signature, a mark, a stamp, anything that indicates the voter's assent to what the contents of that. And so I think that statute's fine. And Kansas, of course, says that anytime the word signature is used in statute, an electronic signature is appropriate. And one more point, if the members of the committee were wondering, when Ms. Levitt talked about the lawsuit we're in, I heard this was coming. We won that lawsuit last year. The judge ruled there was no violation of CORA. In case you're wondering what she was discussing, it really has nothing to do with elections. It had to do with a odd report that is no longer available in the Elvis system. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Okay, let's go ahead and hold questions and we'll get the other neutral and then we'll have questions. Jay Hall.
Thank you, Senator Olson, members of the committee. Jay Hall, Deputy Director for the Kansas Association of Counties. I I echo a lot of the comments made by the Secretary of State. We are also neutral on this bill. It does impact counties in some ways, obviously, because we do actually have to purchase our own election equipment. And as you've heard today from various speakers already, that varies from county to county. One of our concerns is making sure that this is implementable in all of the counties. And so as counties have obviously made those purchasing decisions based on what fits into their budget, we want to make sure that this statute also will work within those budgets and not require them to buy new equipment, because obviously that's a pretty big purchase for our clerk's offices and our election offices. And so they try to build those things out over a number of years and not just over the short term, because that is a large capital purchase for those offices. I think we've cleared up the section on signatures, so I won't touch on that. I do have some questions about the recounts and the audits, but I think if we go through the rule and reg process to clarify that, I think that can become more clear, because I've talked to some clerks that are unsure of what would be required under that. And so that's just a concern that we would have. But if that were to be cleared up through the rule and regulation process, I think that could be handled. And so that's why we stand as a neutral on this bill, and I'd be happy to take questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, questions? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My question is for Clay. So the language of the watermark piece in this bill, would it address, remember our last election where individuals were getting multiple advance ballots in the mail from, I think, Missouri, and our clerk in Cedric County talked about that it was, real additional labor for poll workers because they had to count multiple requests. Because I know some of my constituents said, well, they sent me another one, and so I thought maybe they didn't get that one, so I just filled it out and sent it back. But would it prevent that outburst of just letters? Because, we didn't know if they were from the actual Secretary of State's office or where they were from. Do you recall that incident? And would this measure help correct that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. This measure only applies to the actual ballot. What I think you're referring to are ballot applications, and those can be mailed out. That's in federal court now, and part of that case is still being litigated, but unfortunately, I think the voters of Kansas may still get waves of applications that may confuse them on that, but this watermark would only apply to the ballot, and a voter can only cast one ballot.
Okay, further questions? Senator Straub?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in that portion of the bill talking about electronic signatures requiring a handwritten signature, do any of our electronic poll books allow you to click yes or no? Do you verify this is you? Or do all of them require an actual handwritten electronic signature?
Senator, I can't say I'm familiar with every single poll book, but a poll book in statute is defined as a book that the voter must sign before they're given a ballot. So I believe they all either you hand sign it or sign on a screen.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments? Senator Hildebrand?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Clay, this is for you. Mr. Burgess had talked about if someone was a quadriplegic where you have to have an affidavit. Does that also addressed in the current statutes as a signature? Or would that need to be addressed in this bill?
Senator Hildebrand, the way I read the statute, I believe is if somebody either attempted to make a mark, just assenting, like, yes, this is me getting the ballot, I am who I claim to be. And the registration statute, a little different, actually says another person can sign for the voter if the voter gives permission, and everybody can visualize it. If, for instance, I don't know, their hands were in casts or they couldn't do it. So there are provisions in statute already that seem to foresee the issue of a voter having problem actually putting physical touching on a screen. which I assume would be sort of implicated with this statute.
Thank you.
Further questions? Not seeing any? We'll go ahead and close the hearing on Senate Bill 389. I don't have the folders for the bills I wanted to work today. So I think what we'll do is I'll hold off until tomorrow working any bills. And that way everybody has their notes in front of them. I got copies of some of the bills, but so we'll just wait until tomorrow. We'll be adjourned and we'll work bills tomorrow. Thank you. We're adjourned.